Since the beginning of the 21st century, the United States has made efforts to help India rise as a major power under President George W. Bush. Washington signed a significant agreement with New Delhi, in which the United States supported India's civil nuclear program, despite the country's controversial past regarding nuclear weapons development. Under President Barack Obama, the two countries began cooperating in the national defense industry, promoting the enhancement of India's military capabilities and helping it strengthen its power projection capacity. During President Donald Trump's first term, the United States began sharing sensitive intelligence with India and allowed the country access to advanced technologies that had previously been reserved for close allies. Under President Joe Biden, Washington transferred to New Delhi the first jet engine technology for fighter aircrafts. Recent U.S. administrations have consistently strengthened diplomatic, technological, and military cooperation with India, fulfilling the commitment Bush once made to help India become a global power in the 21st century. The rationale for this commitment is clear. Washington wants to move beyond the divisions of the Cold War era, when the two largest democracies stood on opposing sides, with the Soviet Union gone, India and the United States no longer had reasons for opposition. On the contrary, the two countries have become increasingly connected through people-to-people ties, as the Indian community plays a growing role in the U.S. economy, while New Delhi's post-Cold War economic reforms have opened its markets to American businesses and capital. Beneath these changes lies a deeper geopolitical opportunity. Indian and U.S. officials both recognize that they share many common interests, from combating Islamic extremism to, more crucially, addressing the threat posed by a rising China. While preserving the international rules-based order, Washington correctly assessed that a stronger India would contribute to a stronger America. However, India and the United States do not agree on everything. New Delhi does not support a world where the United States remains the sole superpower. Instead, India envisions a multipolar international system where it holds a position as a true power. India's goal is not just to contain China as a short-term threat, but also to limit any nation's aspiration for hegemony, including those of the United States. From India's perspective, a multipolar order is key to maintaining global peace and advancing its own development. The country has consistently safeguarded its strategic autonomy, avoided formal alliances, and maintained relations with Western adversaries like Iran and Russia. Even as its ties with the U.S. deepen, this approach aims to promote a multipolar world order. However, this strategy may prove ineffective or even unfeasible. While India has experienced economic growth over the past 2 decades, its pace of advancement remains insufficient to balance China, let alone the United States, even in the medium term. In terms of relative GDP, India may become a strong nation by the middle of this century, but it is unlikely to achieve superpower status militarily. It is the largest traditional force in South Asia, but its advantage over regional adversaries remains modest. In the May skirmish, Pakistan used Chinese-supplied defense systems to shoot down Indian aircraft, with China on one side and Pakistan on the other. India constantly faces the risk of a difficult two-front war. Meanwhile, on the domestic political front, India is losing one of its greatest sources of strength, its self-sustaining democracy. As it shifts toward Hindu nationalism, this development could hinder the country's rise by increasing religious tensions and causing further instability in relations with neighboring countries, forcing New Delhi to divert security resources toward internal dialogue instead of expanding its external influence. This illiberal shift also weakens the international rules-based order, which has provided India with significant benefits over the past decades. India's relative weakness, its desire for a multipolar world, and its domestic illiberal trend mean that even if it qualifies to consider itself a major power, its global influence will still fall short of expectations. Becoming the fourth or possibly third largest economy would typically be accompanied by a significant expansion of a nation's global influence, but that may not happen for India. Even by 2047, the centenary of its independence, the country may still have to rely on foreign partners to counter China's power, because India has long maintained a cautious stance toward alliances. Even with close partners, securing external support will not be easy, especially as U.S. foreign policy becomes increasingly interest-driven. And in the event Washington starts to view New Delhi as a competitor in the coming decades, India will certainly grow stronger, but it will not be able to fully leverage that strength, and its global influence will remain limited. High expectations for most of the Cold War period. India's economic performance fell short of its potential, although it moved beyond the stagnation that persisted in the previous century. Before independence between 1950 and 1980, the economy grew by an average of only 35% per year, significantly lower than many other developing countries in the 1980s. The average growth rate improved to around 55%, thanks to some initial economic reforms, but compared to other Asian nations, India's growth remained relatively modest. In 1991, Prime Minister Narasimha Rao and Finance Minister Manmohan Singh aggressively reformed India's command economy by dismantling the so-called Licence Raj system that stifled economic growth. Through excessive regulations, product controls, and a closed domestic market as a result, the economy began to recover in the mid-1990s. Since then, India's GDP has grown at an average of about 65% per year, marking a period of sustained long-term growth. Fortunately, millions of people have been lifted out of poverty, and India has reintegrated into the global economy as an important growth engine. This is also one of the main reasons the United States sees India as a strategic partner and a key counterweight to China. However, despite these impressive recent achievements, India has not caught up with the economic trajectory of China's reform era. Since opening its economy in the late 1970s, China's GDP has grown by nearly 9% per year according to World Bank data, with 15 years of double-digit growth recorded from 1979 to 2023. In contrast, India has never achieved double-digit GDP growth. As a result, while the two economies were similarly regulated in 1980, today China's economy is nearly 5 times larger than India's. Beijing has also leveraged its abundant resources to expand its influence far more aggressively than New Delhi. China has built a larger and more modern military. It has also deeply penetrated the Indo-Pacific region in ways that bolster its economic power, while expanding political influence, sometimes to the point of exerting suffocating pressure on other nations. This explains why New Delhi, despite often taking a tough rhetorical stance, usually avoids direct confrontation with Beijing, unless compelled to act, even when backed by Washington. Naturally, the Indian public is not satisfied with this reality, and many officials expect that in the coming years they can catch up with their northern neighbor. After all, China's economy has slowed significantly over the past decade, with current growth averaging around 4 to 5% annually, which is lower than India. China is also facing multiple constraints that could further hinder growth, including a real estate crisis, high local government debt, and restricted access to Western markets. Most concerning is the unfavorable demographic trend. After years of slowing population growth, China's population declined for the first time in 2022 and continues to age rapidly. The shrinking workforce will severely impact long-term growth prospects and consequently national power. Meanwhile, India retains a demographic advantage. Although the birth rate is decreasing, the country still has a large working-age population. For many years to come, a factor that can help sustain growth momentum and elevate its international standing. Even with China's slowdown, this does not guarantee that India will catch up. In fact, based on current trends, India's economy is unlikely to surpass China's before mid-century. If it ever does to match China, India would need to maintain a stable growth rate of 8% annually for the next 25 years. While China grows only around 2%, this scenario is highly improbable. India has yet to develop a manufacturing powerhouse and likely cannot due to the lack of necessary comparative advantages. The economy still has many protective barriers, hindering exports, and investment in research and development remains low. Despite possessing some advanced manufacturing technologies, the country overall lags in technological processes. Additionally, India has not sufficiently improved the quality of its large labor force. Consequently, it is likely that India will maintain a growth rate of about 6% annually over the next decades, similar to its average in recent decades according to World Bank data through 2023. If this holds true, and China grows at an average of only 2% per year, India's position relative to Beijing would improve significantly. By mid-century, India's GDP could exceed half of China's GDP. However, China could very well achieve a higher average growth rate than 2% in the coming decades. Despite various challenges, China still enjoys significant economic advantages over India, including a more educated, skilled, and healthier workforce, a higher level of technological development, and a greater accumulation of capital. China leads in key technologies such as artificial intelligence, robotics, energy storage, and information and communication technology, which can drive growth even as the population ages. If China grows just slightly higher at around 3% per year, then by mid-century, its economy could still be nearly 3 times the size of India's even if India maintains a 6% growth rate. Long-term growth forecasts are always difficult, but if the past is any guide, by the middle of the 21st century, India may become a great power, yet the weakest among the group of 4 comprising China, the United States, and the European Union. India will not be on par with China, and certainly not on par with the United States. India's approach: if New Delhi wants to contain Beijing, it will certainly need Washington. No other power in the Indo-Pacific region, including Australia or Japan, will be strong enough by 2050 to replace the role of the United States. The European Union may possess significant economic and military capabilities, but its members are not threatened by China in the way that nations in the Indo-Pacific region are. Therefore, New Delhi and Washington will, and in fact must, continue to cooperate. In the years ahead, however, anyone expecting an unconditional friendship will be disappointed despite its weaknesses. India will not accept any alliance with the United States if it threatens its principle of strategic autonomy. The partnership between the two will always have limits, because India does not seek to become part of any formal defense structure and will insist on maintaining its non-aligned position. The aversion to formal alliances partly stems from India's colonial past. The country's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, pledged that India would never become a subordinate member of any great power bloc after centuries of British colonial rule. But this stance also reflects a strategic belief that a rising nation should not trade away future freedom of action for short-term gains. Indian policymakers fear that accepting binding alliance commitments, especially those involving stronger countries, would not only place India at a disadvantage, but also constrain its flexibility in adjusting to the shifting polarities of the international system. At a more pragmatic level, India tends to operate on the assumption that states act based on their own interests. It believes that external support will only come when the benefactor also derives corresponding benefits, and since countries like the United States have an interest in balancing China's power, India expects backing without having to reciprocate with excessive commitments. With this worldview, New Delhi will continue to support a multipolar international system, even if that does not align with Washington's preferences. Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee articulated this ambition clearly in 2004 when he declared that India does not believe unipolarity is a condition of equilibrium in the modern world. He affirmed that India would strive to build a cooperative multipolar world where all legitimate poles of power are recognized and have a voice. Indian leaders across the political spectrum share this vision because they believe multipolarity is the natural state of world order, that the international system is shifting toward multipolarity, and that only multipolarity can ensure global peace by preventing any single power from imposing its will on the rest. Indian Foreign Minister Subramaniam Jaishankar wrote in his book, The India Way: Strategies for an Uncertain World, published in 2020, that New Delhi should advance national interests by identifying and exploiting opportunities arising from global power balances to maximize benefits from as many relationships as possible. A unipolar order undermines this strategy because it does not allow India to leverage balances between power centers. A bipolar world is more favorable, as during the Cold War, India skillfully balanced between the Soviet Union and the United States to its advantage. But a multipolar order remains the ideal. A multipolar world would create more fractures and diverse alliances, allowing India to effectively exploit overlapping interests. In practice, this means India pursues diverse relationships with individual countries and groups, even when some have clear anti-American agendas. New Delhi often plays a moderating role in these forums, which indirectly benefits the United States. However, there are times when, despite deepening bilateral ties with the U.S., India still acts to limit American influence on the international stage regionally. New Delhi has opposed Washington on issues such as climate policy, trade preferences, data sovereignty, e-commerce regulations, and global governance. On highly political matters, India has resisted U.S. sanctions against friendly countries, defended the global South Bloc against Western dominance, and maintained traditional ties with countries like Iran and Russia despite the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. India also seeks to sustain stable relations with China, cooperating where possible and promoting relative peace along their shared border. Unlike Washington, New Delhi cannot tolerate persistent bilateral tensions with Beijing, and depending on future U.S. policy, India may be forced to tilt toward China if circumstances demand. Nonetheless, India's efforts so far have not brought the world any closer to a multipolar order. In fact, if current economic trends continue, a truly multipolar world will remain elusive as China and the United States emerge as the two dominant powers by mid-century. This would result in a bipolar system, and if that happens, India could find itself in a difficult position. The country would disappoint Washington by continuing to engage in non-Western forums like BRICS or the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, only to realize that Beijing holds far greater influence in these groups. And among developing nations, so far India has avoided this dilemma because successive U.S. administrations have chosen to overlook these frictions. But a less accommodating administration, such as a potential future Trump leadership, may not be as tolerant. For example, India's attempts to conduct some trade transactions in local currencies rather than the U.S. dollar aimed at shielding against U.S. sanctions on third parties could provoke American nationalist sentiment and lead to restrictions on cooperation with India even if it avoids penalties. India should remain cautious about the multipolar ideal for other reasons. In a truly multipolar system, New Delhi would benefit less from the global public goods currently provided by the United States, such as securing maritime routes in the Indian Ocean. To compensate, India would have to bear significant financial costs and enhance its capabilities beyond current levels. Moreover, the country might fail to balance against China if the other two powers, the United States and the European Union, decide to leave the weakest member, India, to fend for itself. In a multipolar order, India could end up worse off than under a US-led unipolar system or even within a US-China bipolar model. Therefore, India's current strategy of seeking US support while promoting a multipolar order to dilute Washington's power is both counterproductive and unwise. The fragility of pluralism. India's prospects as a strong nation are not only defined by how it manages relations with other countries, but are also shaped by its foundational political character. And it is in this realm that the country is undergoing a profound and dangerous transformation. For decades, India was seen as a shining success story of democracy. Since gaining independence in 1947, the country has held 18 general elections, with an average voter turnout of 60%, a figure that has tended to increase over time. More importantly, from the very beginning of the republic, all adult citizens in India were granted universal suffrage regardless of gender, caste, or economic status. Citizens also enjoyed essential fundamental rights, such as freedom, liberty, and religious freedom, all protected by the judiciary. The Indian government once suspended these rights between 1975 and 1977, when Prime Minister Indira Gandhi notoriously declared a state of emergency, which allowed her to rule as a dictator and imprison political opponents. Yet the Indian people resisted her authoritarianism, and she ultimately relinquished power in an election she herself had called, hoping to consolidate her authority. What makes India's democracy particularly remarkable is that it thrived under conditions where democracy usually fails. Political science research has shown that the success of democracy is closely tied to per capita income levels. Many third world countries that started with democratic regimes quickly descended into dictatorship or autocracy after independence. But India did not. Despite widespread poverty, democracy in India flourished as its leaders sustained a competitive political life. A key component of this resilience is the Indian Constitution, a document filled with provisions ensuring respect for every individual. To prevent tyranny of the majority, Indian citizenship was defined entirely by the principle of use solely, or birthright citizenship, rather than by characteristics such as religion, property, or race. The Constitution also provided specific legal protections for minority groups, such as the right to manage their own religious and charitable institutions, alongside universal rights like freedom of belief, worship, and religious propagation. India also established a federal system, allowing various linguistic groups to form their own states, thereby preserving the country's cultural diversity. The Constitution deliberately limited executive power by empowering both the legislature and judiciary at the federal and state levels to serve as checks, while also creating space for civil society, where citizens could exercise rights of speech, assembly, and legislation clearly and effectively. This is what made India's political system not just a democracy, but one with a deeply liberal character. As Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru affirmed, the country's founders sought to build a just society by just means they believed in. History proved that even a poor nation could protect individual freedoms and reject the autocratic promise of rapid economic growth. Yet today, India is steadily departing from those founding principles, unlike Cold War-era India, a country that remained firmly liberal despite lacking economic success. Modern India, though economically stronger, is increasingly marked by liberalism and authoritarianism. Its long-standing political tradition is being overshadowed by Hindu nationalism and ideology that views India as a land for Hindus, where religious minorities, though not explicitly excluded, are regarded as second-class citizens. This ideology, known as Hindutva, was rejected by India's founders and long marginalized in politics, but it never disappeared. Since the 1990s, it has resurged, first gaining power through the Bharatiya Janata Party (BJP) in the late 1990s, and especially since 2014, when Prime Minister Narendra Modi won a sweeping victory. The rise of Hindutva has brought divisive policies, alienating nearly 200 million Muslims and around 30 million Christians in India simultaneously. The BJP has sought to consolidate higher caste Hindus who previously felt sidelined, trying to forge a unified Hindu voting bloc which could represent a significant majority. Meanwhile, Hindu nationalists promote the view that other minority faiths like Buddhism, Jainism, and Sikhism are essentially branches of Hinduism. All of this stems from the broader belief that only belief systems originating in the Indian subcontinent are truly Indian. The assault on the secular ideals of India's constitution is accompanied by creeping authoritarianism, although rewriting the constitution remains out of reach despite some calls for its complete replacement. Change is occurring through the erosion of citizenship norms and the weaponization of institutions once seen as neutral. Echoing the tactics from the emergency era, the Modi government has used tax authorities and legal tools to pressure critics, civil society, regulatory bodies, and opposition-run state governments. Yet Indian democracy is not dead. The country still holds competitive elections. A faint sign suggests a liberal revival in the latest general election. The BJP lost its outright majority in parliament and had to form a coalition government. In reality, the party never won a majority of the popular vote, securing a parliamentary majority only because of the first-past-the-post electoral system. Despite its efforts, Hindutva has not captured the majority of Indian voters. The opposition still governs about one-third of India's states. Liberal forces, though under strain, continue to resist the Hindutva tide. Courts and some institutional mechanisms still have the capacity to check abuses of power. The question remains whether India has already become an illiberal power or whether it has not yet fully crossed that line. However, if the country's political foundations do not return to their previous trajectory, the consequences will be severe for the world. India will no longer serve as a model of liberal democracy at a time when the world desperately needs such examples. The country will be unable to contribute positively to the liberal international order, an order that promises political stability and economic prosperity. What is currently under serious threat, in fact, if both India and the United States were to remain liberal democracies for the long term, the post-war order, which has benefited both nations despite contemporary criticisms, would suffer grave damage. Prolonged illiberalism in these two countries, often viewed as pillars of liberalism, would embolden similar political forces elsewhere. In a 2015 speech in New Delhi, President Barack Obama noted that if America can set an example of diversity while still working together for a common purpose, and if India, a deeply diverse and complex nation, can continue to affirm its democracy, then that would be an example for every country in the world. Yet today, neither the United States nor India is passing that test. An illiberal India could also become more unstable. The BJP's policies have polarized the country along ideological and religious lines, and unresolved disputes over how to redistribute parliamentary representation to reflect shifting demographics threaten to deepen regional and linguistic divisions. India increasingly mirrors the United States in this regard, a country fractured by deepening polarization. This condition is dangerous enough for the United States, where it has already weakened institutions and eroded democratic norms, but the consequences for India are even more serious given its weaker state institutions and civil society. Polarization could ignite long-simmering armed insurgencies against the central government and create openings for foreign interference and manipulation amidst domestic turmoil. These conflicts could also spill over into neighboring countries, as religious hostility toward Muslims heightens tensions with both Bangladesh and Pakistan. Internally, polarization would impose growing security burdens on India, draining resources that New Delhi might otherwise deploy to strengthen its international influence. And even if polarization does not trigger significant internal unrest, it will still hinder efforts to mobilize national resources to enhance India's power. The combination of moderate economic growth, persistent efforts to maintain partnerships with all countries, without establishing a special relationship with any one of them, and the increasing trend of a liberalism at home is producing in India. That does not align with the expanding scale of its power, although India is set to become the third or fourth largest economy in the world. Its poor development indicators suggest that its large population will not translate into higher quality of life nor significantly contribute to national power in the way that China, the United States, and Europe have managed. Even if the economy continues to expand, India will still face old development challenges, including social deficits and widespread discontent, factors that could threaten the country's social stability and national strength. If India's growth remains largely dependent on expanding its domestic market without closely integrating into the global economy as China did for several decades, its ability to accelerate growth will be limited. At the same time, India will forfeit opportunities to influence policy choices in the broader region. Scholars have long argued that the minimum standard for a country to be considered a great power is its ability to shape outcomes beyond its immediate borders. Unfortunately, India currently does not meet this standard in either East Asia or the Middle East, and this situation is unlikely to change significantly in the coming decades given the growing roles of China and the United States in these regions. Therefore, tightly linking India's economic future with the ongoing geoeconomic developments in these regions is essential, particularly as India seeks to solidify its position as the dominant power in South Asia. Even if India maintains a growth rate of around 6% per year over the next decades, it will still be far outpaced by China in Asia. This means India will have to rely on an external balancing strategy, cooperating with external powers to contain China. The most suitable candidate for this strategy remains the United States. Despite its internal challenges, the U.S. is likely to maintain its position as the leading global power for decades to come. New Delhi and Washington have made significant strides in balancing Chinese power in recent years, but India's success in forging a closer partnership with the U.S. has been hindered by its focus on promoting a multipolar world through a policy of multiple alignments, implicitly suggesting that India will soon become a peer competitor to China, the U.S., and Europe. Capable of balancing China on its own, this prospect remains distant, and the belief hampers India's ability to establish a robust defense cooperation mechanism against China. This might be acceptable if India could independently expand its military capabilities to counter the Chinese threat, while supporting other nations in the Indo-Pacific region facing pressure from Beijing, but this is unlikely in the near future given the current and projected GDP gap with China. India will struggle to catch up with its northern neighbor in modernizing its military. Beijing's military capabilities have already surpassed India's, and with a higher national spending capacity as a percentage of GDP, China can continue to increase its defense budget with less economic strain than India, further strengthening its military position. India's reluctance to deepen defense cooperation with the U.S., though understandable, is making it harder to balance China worse. Still, India's ambition to promote a multipolar world puts it at odds with the U.S. on many issues related to the international order. Precisely when collaboration with Washington should be a priority, India should not delude itself into thinking it can restrain China alone, which it cannot, while simultaneously advocating for a multipolar world. That diminishes the U.S. role. In the past, the U.S. tolerated these Indian maneuvers partly because both countries were fundamentally liberal democracies. But if both continue drifting toward a liberalism, their shared value connection will erode, leading to a more transactional bilateral relationship with Washington, demanding more from New Delhi in exchange for partnership. Trump's approach to India in a potential second term already signaled this shift in reality. India's inability to catch up with China, combined with its enduring commitment to multipolarity, fundamentally at odds with U.S. interests, will be a significant disadvantage for Washington. It appears India will collaborate with the U.S. in some areas related to China, but comprehensive coordination across all critical domains, including those concerning Beijing, is unlikely. If New Delhi cannot effectively balance Beijing in Asia, Washington will have to reconsider how much to invest in and rely on India and a liberal United States might still support an illiberal India because assisting New Delhi carries intrinsic value. The costs are not too high, and India's success still partially serves American interests. But if one or both countries become a liberal, there will no longer be any ideological basis for the United States to help India. Of course, a narrowed Bilateral relationship focused solely on interests rather than shared values would not be disastrous for either nation, but it would signify a contraction of ambition. The bilateral relationship once defined by post-war cooperation during the Cold War and the maintenance of a liberal international order would now be reduced to the singular goal of containing a common rival, China. If that is the case, then neither India nor the United States nor the world at large will benefit much from this partnership. Here is the full translation of the article, and in addition, I would like to provide an analysis I previously made about the QUAD under Trump. To complement some perspectives in the article, note that this analysis was conducted back in November 2024, so some details may no longer be accurate or updated. Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, also known as the Quad or Diamond Quadrilateral, is a strategic cooperation framework between the U.S., Japan, India, and Australia with the goal of promoting a free, open, and rules-based Indo-Pacific region. QUAD is not a formal military alliance, or rather a mechanism for cooperation on security, economic, technology, and global governance issues. QUAD was first convened for humanitarian support after the 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake and tsunami. Later, Trump revived QUAD-20 to increase pressure on and contain China's BRI initiative. Essentially, QUAD emerged from the vision of the Indo-Pacific as a single strategic space where developments in one region inevitably affect others. There are two main drivers behind the group, and this vision. First, the US, Australia, India, and Japan are interested in preserving the rules, norms, and benefits of the existing order, strengthening current regimes, ensuring freedom of maritime navigation and commerce, and providing connectivity, economic development, and security within established rules and standards. Second, all four Quad members believe that the rise of China and the scope of its Belt and Road Initiative pose a threat to them and the region. However, there are latent issues within this organization, most notably India's diplomatic dilemma. Specifically, despite its heightened wariness of China and the revival of the Quad, India still has to consider long-standing security, diplomatic, and economic calculations. India's vision of the Indo-Pacific focuses more on the Indian Ocean and less on the Pacific, where the US, Australia, and Japan see the greatest threat from China. For India, the Indo-Pacific stretches from the eastern coast of Africa to the western and southern Pacific, including parts of the Middle East. In contrast, the US does not include Africa or the Middle East in its Indo-Pacific concept. Moreover, India does not support any notion of the Quad as an alliance of democracies against China. As characterized by Joe Biden, India long abandoned non-alignment after the Cold War, but still avoids joining formal alliances with any country or group. India is also keenly aware that China overtook the US as its top trading partner since 2021. Another dilemma stems from India's traditionally nationalist stance that does not emphasize democracy or democratic values in its foreign policy. India is also extremely sensitive to criticism and any accusations of growing authoritarianism and a liberalism under Modi's government could strain relationships. Finally, although US-India partnerships have grown rapidly in recent years, India still harbors caution toward the US as a fully reliable and trustworthy long-term partner. Therefore, while other Quad countries prioritize confronting China, India is less inclined to do so. For example, India wants to contain China, but also does not want to contain China due to both trade interests and domestic considerations rather than escalating tensions. India prefers to watch from the sidelines as China and other nations contend with each other. The limits on escalating into a military alliance were affirmed during the 2021 Quad Summit, where the nations emphasized cooperation on COVID-19 vaccine distribution, climate change technology, and scientific expertise, while avoiding direct security commitments against China. Despite these latent issues, QUAD remains very important to India, and India plays a crucial role in the QUAD. Fortunately, India is the only member in this group with contiguous land to the Indian Ocean. Additionally, the Quad provides India with security assurances against Chinese threats, and Trump's new term relations within the group may strengthen, but will likely tilt towards a transactional approach rather than serving broader geopolitical containment goals as before. Trump would collaborate despite political disagreements as long as it benefits the US. This means that while cooperative activities may increase, they will be US-centered with the member states, meaning the US will prioritize its Quad partners over other regions rather than conducting cohesive bloc-wide operations. If bloc activities occur, they will mostly focus on economically isolating China and possibly expanding military cooperation through joint exercises and intelligence sharing.